Hello everyone and welcome to the final round of the World Rapid Championship, where we have a four-way tie. Nepo, Caruana, Abdusattorov and Magnus Carlsen are sharing first place with 9 points, but going into the final round, Nepo and Caruana drew their game after like maybe 5 moves, as it seems that Fabi did not know that only 2 people can go into tiebreaks. He probably thought maybe more people can go into tiebreaks, and he thought a draw in the final round was a good result. But this automatically means that he can no longer be a contender for first place. So that leaves Magnus, Hikaru playing here, and Abdusattorov, all depending on how his game against Duda goes. So let's check it out. It's quite an interesting game, and a lot has happened. So here Hikaru opens with d4. We have d5 by Magnus, c4. We have e6, knight to f3, knight to f6, and now knight to c3. We have bishop to e7, so the 3 knights variation of the Queen's Gambit declined. Bishop to f4. And Magnus castles. We have e3 and Magnus strikes with c5. We have d captures on c5, bishop captures on c5, and queen to c2. So just developing pieces, nothing out of the ordinary. Knight to c6, and now rook to d1. This is actually a position from the World Chess Championship match Carlsen had against Caruana, where Magnus first played a3, and if you remember, then we had queen to a5. Fabio went into this very sneaky line, and after Magnus played rook to d1, there was a rook to d8, that glass-shattering move that Magnus really took Magnus by surprise. But here Hikaru avoids the a3 move. He goes rook to d1 right away, and Magnus now doesn't go queen to a5, which is the standard move in this position. Pretty much everyone plays queen to a5. Here he plays queen to b6, and now what do you do here? Well, it's a very interesting move. Obviously, you can play knight to a4, but just queen to a5 checks, so you don't really gain anything by this. So instead, we have bishop to e2. Hikaru doesn't seem to be familiar with this, so he just wants the castle as soon as possible. And now Magnus strikes in the center with the d4. He wants to create some imbalances in the position and get winning chances, even if it's with the black pieces. So e captures on d4, knight captures, we have knight captures, bishop captures, and Hikaru castles to safety. We have bishop to d7 by Magnus, and now there is a game where queen to d2 was played, but here we have bishop to f3, and it is now only as a move 14 that we have a completely new game. Interestingly, Magnus is up some 5 to 6 minutes on the clock. Hikaru is down to 10 minutes, whereas Magnus has some 16 minutes on the clock, so more than when he started with. So he's well within known territory. So here we have rook 8 to d8, and now Hikaru strikes with b4. He says there's no point in waiting with this move or preparing it with a move like a3, because if queen captures on b4, the bishop here is hanging. So of course we can't play that, and you always have to be careful of c5 coming. So Magnus plays bishop to c6. He attacks the light square bishop here, and now bishop captures on c6, and now Magnus is the one who spent nearly 5 minutes on this move. He thought about queen captures on c6, but this is well, too drawish of a move, so he played b captures on c6. This brings imbalance into the position, and now anything can be played here. It's 8 minutes for Magnus, 7 minutes for Hikaru, and here we have knight to e2 attacking Carlsen's bishop here. We have e5 by Magnus, and now you could go back with bishop to d2, but Hikaru plays knight captures on d4. We have e captures on d4. Magnus gets a pass pawn, and now bishop to g5. Here was a very interesting moment where Hikaru could have gone for bishop to d6, attacking the rook, and well, here just if you don't want to move the rook, you could even go for rook captures c5 and queen captures on b4. This isn't bad for black. And now let's say rook b1, we attack the queen before we capture back. Queen to a3, now rook b3, and now Magnus would give up the queen here with queen captures on b3, a captures on d3, and we would have this completely insane game where Magnus would have a knight and the rook for a queen. For example, queen to c3, we're going to play rook d5, bring the other rook into the game, and hopefully push that past pawn. But it's a very tricky move to calculate with so little time on the clock, so Hikaru goes bishop to g5, pins the knight, and prepares to capture. At least he will have some queen f5, queen captures on f6 action, where he can at least force a draw. So here, queen captures on b4 by Magnus, bishop captures on f6, g captures, and now queen to f5. asking Magnus, what do you do here? And in fact, it's perfectly fine to capture the pawn. It's really the best move in the position, because after queen captures, you can play queen e6, and if queen g5 check, queen to g6 blocks check, and you are enjoying your extra pawn. However, here Magnus played rook f to e8, and now Hikaru played queen captures on f6. Interestingly, you could also just play queen g4 check and pick up the d4 pawn, also possible, but it seems Hikaru missed this. It's the last round of the World Rapid Championship, so I guess both of them are extremely excited. So queen captures on f6 was played, and now queen to d6. Magnus offers a queen trade, and he wants to go into a rook and pawn endgame. Queen g5 check, Magnus plays queen to g6, and now f4. This is how Hikaru wants to trade. He wants to get the semi-open f-file for the rook, and now Magnus could try to kick away the queen or force a trade on his own terms, but he accepts the queen trade, f captures, and now rook to e5, goes after the pawn, but Hikaru plays rook to f4. He goes after this pawn, and Magnus prefers to keep the pawn, so he doesn't want to trade, and he doesn't want to play c5 and allow h4. Instead, he plays d3. He wants to have an active game, and now Hikaru plays rook to d2. It's very interesting. If you just play h4 now, we're going to play rook to e2, and this is now a very active rook attacking this pawn. Now d2 is also coming. So instead, Hikaru first plays rook to d2, doesn't allow rook to e2, and now rook captures on g5. We have rook to f3, this pawn will now fall, and now rook to d4, going after the c4 pawn. And here Hikaru is already down to a minute and a half, whereas Magnus has some 4.5 minutes on the clock. So here we have rook captures on d3, rook captures on c4, and now rook to g3, offering a rook trade, and Hikaru is confident that he can hold this endgame, being down only a pawn. So rook c5, this is how Magnus will trade. We have rook captures, and now rook to a3, going after the a7 pawn, and now Magnus defends it with a5. We have rook to c3, going after this pawn, now rook to b5. So we're gonna give up this pawn, and we will try to advance this pawn. So rook captures on c6, now comes rook b2. We go after the pawn, a4, now comes rook b4, and now king to f2. Magnus grabs the a4 pawn, and now it's the passed a pawn against Hikaru's rook. So let's see what happens. We have rook to a6, very principled. You have to put the rook behind the passed pawn. And now h5. We have h4, and now rook to f4 with check. We have king to e3 and rook to f5. Magnus defends his position like this, and now he will try to get the king into the game, maybe push f6, maybe make some progress. We have g3, king to g7, and now king to e4. Attacking the rook, we have rook to b5, and now king to f4. We have f6 by Magnus, now comes rook to a7 check, king to g6, and now king to e4. So this is actually a completely drawn position, but if you play correctly, well, that's easier said than done, as both of them are extremely low on the clock. Rook b4 check, king to f3, we have rook b3 check, king f4, rook to a3. Now Magnus will try to push the passed a pawn. We have rook to c7, and now we have a4. We have rook back to a7, now comes rook to a2. Magnus tries to make progress this way. Rook to a5, and now we have a3. We have king f3, now comes rook to a1. We have king to f2, now comes f5. So trying to make a little bit of a progress here, and also if the white rook starts checking us, we're gonna go all the way to b7. So here we have rook a6 check, king to f7, and now king to g2. A most interesting maneuver by Hikaru. King to e7, now comes rook a5, going after the pawn here, king to e6, and now king to h2. Magnus delivers a check here with rook to a2 check, and Hikaru plays king to h3, and now this is a very dangerous square for the king, because the king is now completely cut off from the game. We have king f6 by Magnus, rook to a8, and now comes king to e5. We have rook to a4, and now king to d5, and here Hikaru plays rook to f4, goes after the pawn, then he wants to grab this pawn, and this is in fact a winning position for Magnus, but it requires a super precise move, so feel free to pause the video and win the game for Magnus while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting this incredible idea. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is rook to e2. This is the only move that wins the game. Point being that after rook captures an f5 check, you can play rook to e5. And now, of course, after rook to f2, defending the a2 square, now we play king to c4, and there's really nothing white can do. King b3, a2 is coming, and that's it. This is how we win the game. However, Magnus played king to e6. He missed this opportunity, and now we have rook to f3 by Hikaru. King e5, rook to e3 check, king to d4, and now rook to f3. And now we have king back to e4. The problem is you can't really make any progress here. If you go with king to c4, then you could even capture on f5, and there's really nothing you can do. At some point, you can even capture the pawn and maybe even, you know, give up the rook for this pawn. The two connected pass pawns will be enough to counter the rook, or many possibilities are present here. So instead, king to e4, we have rook to f4 check, king to e3, and now rook captures on f5. We have rook to a1, now hoping to get a2 and the rook to h1 check in, but Hikaru quickly goes back. King to g2, we have rook to a2 check, king to h3, and it was in this position on move 66 that Hikaru and Magnus agreed to a draw, as there is nothing more to be done here. If you try a2, there's no way to deliver any check, and there's just rook a5, and you don't really have a move here. If king e4, even g4 is possible. Captures h5, and now it's even white who's threatening to promote the dh pawn. So after this king to h3 move, they agreed to a draw. And what does this mean for the tournament, where there are a couple of people tied for first place? I don't know if the exact standings are done yet, but yeah, it would seem that Magnus is out of the competition for first place, and as it would seem here, at least on their table base, it seems that it will be Abdusatorov versus Yanni Pomeshi fighting for first place in the tie breaks, but we're gonna cover that in the next video, depending on what they decide. That's the game. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Tough move to miss this rook to e2, but it was a chance for Magnus to win the entire thing. He missed it, and even if he missed it, then you know it's not an easy move to find. There you have it. Once again, hope you guys enjoyed this little rook and pawn endgame tutorial. I would like to thank Catherine Maltarich, Jack Schroeder, Jeffrey Rydenor, Evgeny Brishkin, and David Kimura for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of this wonderful event until it finishes. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.